Hey, this is Michelle coming in at the top of the show just to say the same thing I've said a few times. I'm so sorry this episode is so gosh darn late after a month of not putting out an episode. Basically what happened was there was a pandemic that started becoming totally fucking terrifying. And that slowed production down because I have pretty recently been diagnosed with ADHD and taking new meds and stuff. But still, that pandemic thing is pretty gosh darn distracting, even for people that don't have issues around being distracted and concentration stuff. So I'm sure you understand why this is so late, but the main reason I want to put something at the top is that, as you know, trans, non-binary, intersex, etc. people are more prone to loneliness. They're more prone to isolated lives that can lead to issues around their mental health and other related gnarly shit. And I don't see this whole pandemic thing necessarily helping with that. So what me and Ashley have decided to do is put together a Discord where it is just trans, non-binary, intersex, gender questioning and gender non-conforming people who are allowed in. There will be no cisgender people. Sorry, cisgender people who are listening. We love you, but we gotta need our own space on this thing. I hope you understand. Because, to put it bluntly, a lot of prides are going to get cancelled, a lot of events are going to get cancelled. Trying to get to your community is going to be harder than ever, and it was already pretty hard for a lot of people anyway. So, this is our response to try and make sure you always have access to some kind of community whilst in isolation and whilst things take their course. So, check the link in the description, click on that and follow the instructions and we'll get you on board. So you can start chatting with loads of people like you. Thank you for your patience. We're going to be putting out episodes as often as we can going forward. During all of this, we aren't going anywhere. Thankfully, because we are not reliant on this as a money-making venture, it's basically going to be business as usual, especially for me, because the way I live my life tends to be in isolation anyway, because, you know, mental health issues, disabilities, staying at home a lot. So my life isn't going to change that much. So as long as I'm able and as long as Ashley's able, we're going to keep doing this show. So, sorry it was so late. A lot of this is going to be out of date by now, but we don't talk about the virus in any big way. This could be the distraction you're looking for. So enjoy the show and see you on Discord.
The category is What the Trans, darling?
Hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans, we're back!
We are indeed back. Took a bit of a break. Unplanned, slightly unfortunate if we're honest, but we are now, as you say, back. How you doing, Michelle?
I'm doing good. I have now done 1 full month of my new medication, and it is going pretty good.
Excellent.
What isn't quite going as good is sort of relearning how to, well, not just relearning, I guess learning how to live like a functioning adult. Because now I have no excuse for when I don't do the washing up. Before, like, I'd be able to say, oh, ADHD, oh, God, I'm so sorry. Now when I don't do the washing up, it's purely, entirely because of laziness.
I don't think, let's not frame it in those terms. I'm not sure of your optics there. However, I mean, yeah, there's going to be a period of adjustment, isn't there? We're, sort of getting used to the way things roll around in these parts now. So, I really apologize to any of our American listeners. That must have been shockingly bad.
The only problem I had was there was a good while where getting to sleep was a bit of a nightmare. I've had a few sleepless nights, which definitely got in the way of trying to put together this podcast.
Indeed.
But apart from that, I think I've leveled out. So if anybody is out there, wanting to know anything about ADHD medication, don't come to me. I've been on them for a month. I don't know anything and I'm not a doctor. Yeah. So go talk to your doctor unless they're busy dealing with this fucking virus nonsense that's going around.
Yes, quite.
How are you doing?
I'm all right. Honestly, this, obviously a couple of weeks of break that we've had was in a sense quite well timed because it wasn't such an easy couple of weeks for me, really. I've been out of work for a while. That gets terribly frustrating. You start to think of it as a reflection of who you are as a person, the fact that you're not even capitalism has poisoned our minds to the extent that, if you're not working and doing something and contributing to society, you're made to feel quite useless, essentially. And so, I've been internalizing a lot of that, and there's been some faff, essentially, mental health wise, but you don't want to hear me witter on about all of that sort of thing. Hope remains, as always. And so I did do one thing, which is I went home. I went back to Wigan for an evening and it's the most me reason for going back to Wigan ever, which is that I was going to watch Twelfth Night at Wigan Little Theatre, which is where I used to do a lot of acting-y type stuff. And so there were obviously some people who were still there and were in the play, and it's just like, gosh, this is all very, I literally feel like a teenager again.
Had you been back to this theatre since,
No, I had not. No, I haven't. I haven't been back at all in something like 10, possibly 12 years. Obviously, I came out as trans in 2012, so 8 years ago this September. So, some new, of course, word had to some extent gotten around, but for most of them, I'd kind of just disappeared. So, like, oh wow, you're not dead. No, I'm not, actually. Thank you.
In fact, I'm more alive than I've ever been.
Pretty much, yeah. I may have said that at one point, but so it was lovely, but it was very, it wasn't so much a stroll down memory lane as getting mugged while strolling down memory lane. It was like, oh god, just overwhelmed by all the stuff.
I don't want to deviate too much from the programme that we have planned, but I do want to ask one thing, because I really, for some reason, I really hated, after a certain point of me coming out and transitioning, I really hated running into people that I hadn't met yet. So, like, 2 years into being Michelle, I was still meeting people who hadn't seen me since, they saw me in the dark before times.
Indeed.
And I fucking hated that. Is that something you had?
Yes and no. Like, as in, I think the people that I was around immediately at the time I transitioned were definitely aware of and supportive of the trans thing. And it was through that being the case that I'd actually felt confident enough to come out. And I'd moved to a different city from where I grew up and from where I went to uni. So I wasn't running into people particularly frequently. We weren't at the same events and stuff because we're all four sticks to the wind. So it wasn't so much of a thing. And this example of it, going back to the theatre the other night, was very nice. And I don't know if word had gotten around or if somebody had briefed somebody else, but there were 2 or 3 people who I knew before, hadn't seen since, but they came over and said, "Hello, Ashley. It's lovely to see you again." So, I hadn't spoken to them, but they knew that I am Ashley now. And, so...
that makes it easier. Like, when I was running to these people, like, 2-3 years in, it was just like, oh, I've just done this.
Yeah.
Now I have to explain the whole fucking thing again? Oh, my God.
That's fair. No, I mean, obviously it's sort of... yeah. Anyway, I think perhaps as lovely as these personal distractions and you lovely audience, listener people getting to know us a little bit more... as fascinating as I'm sure that is for you. Let's get on and do the podcast, shall we?
Yeah, we've got a jam-packed episode.
We have, yeah. It's been very up and down, hasn't it? The kind of vibe for the last few weeks.
Yeah, and I want to preface this initial story with there is a second part to the story that I'm going to start with today, but that's going to come at the end, and it'll become clear as to why. But to start with, yes, it has been a very, very mixed couple of weeks for trans people in general. But we're going to be focusing on the goings-on inside the Houses of Parliament, and specifically the House of Commons, when it comes to trans people, as the UK Parliament held 2 debates recently where trans issues, mostly around trans women...
Shocker.
Sorry, any non-binary people and trans men listening, but it seems to be the trans women have taken over Parliament when it comes to discussions over the last week.
Yay.
But yeah, there were 2 debates where trans issues came up in Parliament. We're going to look at the debate held on the 5th of March to mark International Women's Day, which took place on the following Sunday, the 8th of March. So during the debate, many women from all the different parties stood up to talk about the issues facing women in the UK and beyond, including Labour MP Jess Phillips, who did her usual reading of the names of the women who have been murdered by men in the previous year, Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities Dawn Butler, and the new chair of the Women and Equalities Parliamentary Select Committee, Caroline Noakes. But when it comes to the issues of trans women, the only time trans women came up were in speeches made by Conservative MP Jackie Doyle-Price and Scottish National Party MP Joanna Cherry QC, both of whom managed to pack a whole load of transphobia into their speeches because, of course they did, because that seems to be what they do. So starting with Doyle-Price, who for what it's worth voted against gay marriage and was absent for the recent vote on gay marriage in Northern Ireland, so, not a good place to start. She used her speech as an opportunity to spout the usual Mumsnet talking points in regards to trans people and self-ID, GRA reform, or whatever name it has this week. She claimed that trans rights are in direct conflict with women's rights, but failed to mention specifically how. She then claimed that trans people want to live quietly and get on with their lives, and that it doesn't help trans people to be pitted in this toxic debate, whilst also claiming that there are men who want to self-identify as women as a weapon, in her words, and those men who want to use self-identity as a weapon are the people who are winning during the debate against trans people and women's rights. Again, she did not specify which men, or indeed how they would use the right to self-identify, as she puts it, to harm women, apart from pointing at the case of Karen White as an example of the kind of situations she wants to stop. For those who don't know, Karen White is a trans woman who was convicted of and has admitted to sexually assaulting and raping cis women. Doyle Price did not mention the fact that the prison that Karen White was placed in decided to put her in the general population instead of facilities designed to keep dangerous prisoners away from the general population, but seemed to put all the blame for that Karen White situation on Karen White being able to define herself as a woman, and that Karen White is actually a man using the trans thing to get to victims, which, Christ alive, is a bold claim.
It sure is.
Considering that nobody outside the Ministry of Justice knows anything about Karen White, really, apart from the crimes she has committed and confessed to. But whatever. Fuck trans people, right? Fuck any of the facts about the Karen White specific thing that went on. Just fuck trans people, alright? So, the main takeaway, Doyle Price used her time on International Women's Day to make sure that the only trans woman mentioned by name at all during the whole debate on International Women's Day was a sex offender whose name was evoked to back up her calls for a rollback on trans equality in the UK. Brilliant. But not stopping there, her bizarre speech continued, and she called for the government to look at the treatment of young people who are trans. She claims that the treatments for young trans people are irreversible, whilst not specifying which treatments are reversible, as any trans person listening to this will know, that everything up to hormone replacement therapy and surgery is reversible. She then also claims that young people are not legally able to give consent to such treatments, which is, again, incorrect, as young people have been able to have their say over their healthcare in this country since 1985, when the Gillick Competence Standard came into force in the UK as a framework to use to assess whether someone under the age of 16 has the insight and ability to consent to their own healthcare treatments. She then goes on to say that she may well have been a trans kid because she liked climbing trees or whatever, because she didn't at all see that post on Mumsnet and just decide to read it out, basically. That isn't at all what happened.
Definitely
but anyway,
not.
But to top it all off, she made the bizarre claim that one of the classic symptoms of autism is, in her words, that as a self-defense tactic, an autistic person becomes a different personality. She then goes on to say that this could be why young people are seeking trans-related healthcare, the rationale being that they are taking on other personalities that aren't necessarily them, and therefore, when one of them says they're trans, that should be seen as a symptom of autism, I guess. I asked several trans people I know in life that have varying degrees of autism spectrum disorder, and I asked them if this is a thing, and every single one said no. The only explanation that any of them could give me was, well, the only explanation I got that could maybe explain why she made this bizarre claim was when one person we asked said to me that this could be her getting confused about the concept of masking, where autistic people adopt certain behaviours to mask autistic characteristics to get by in a neurotypical world.
Indeed.
Obviously, if you are someone who lives with autism spectrum disorder and can shed some light on this point and can explain just what the hell she's talking about, please let us know through the Twitter at WhatTheTrans, or go to our website, whatthetrans.com, and send us an email through there and tell us what the hell she could be talking about. Because this sounds completely thoroughly confusing to me, as someone who has done as much reading as I can on autism spectrum disorder for the episode we did on it, and I've never met a single autistic person that has said this is a thing. But I think it's safe to say that neither of us here on the podcast consider Doyle Price's views on autism, trans people, trans legal equality, or transgender children to be coming from a place of authority, to say the least.
No, we do not think that.
Moving on to the other person who decided to fill International Women's Day with transphobia, Scottish National Party MP Joanna Cherry QC, who took the baton from Doyle Price and spent 10 minutes of her 13-minute speech going on about how trans women are men and that women should have the right to gather without including men. She railed against no platforming being used against feminists asserting their rights and went on to point out the amount of abuse her and others have faced. Now, when it comes to online abuse and other abuse in general, I think everyone listening can say that they are against online abuse in all its forms. I'd also like to think that we can all see that nobody should ever type and send a death threat, which is something that Joanna Cherry said had happened to her. And as someone myself who has received death threats in the past, I can tell you, don't fucking do that. It's terrifying. Stop doing that if that's what you're doing. However, Cherry made the point of saying that to be called transphobic is in itself abusive, and did not appear to differentiate between a trans person telling her that she is a transphobe, which she is, and a trans person calling her vile names or sending death threats. Which is great, because how the fuck are we supposed to point out transphobic stuff if cis people decide that doing so is in and of itself abusive?
Well, that's rather their point, wouldn't you say?
I would think so, yes. So finally, to round up all of the different speeches that were happening this day, it is important to go over the speech of our current Minister for Women and Equalities, Conservative MP Liz Truss. The speech that she gave did not mention trans people once, but she did speak out against identity politics in much the same way she has done previously, saying she wants to get rid of, and I quote, the cult of female exceptionalism, the idea that women are more trustworthy, empathetic, and make better bosses than men, whilst also saying she would like to do the same to the cult of male exceptionalism. She went on to speak about how women are stepping up in the business world and how the free market is great for gender equality.
What?
I'm just going to leave that there.
Yeah.
And while she did mention lesbian and bisexual women, she did not mention trans women, but did find the time to say that, and I quote, when I talk to women across our country, they're not interested in identity politics. What they're interested in is how their families and their communities can get on in life. And that's why we as a government are focused on tackling the barriers that hold people back and levelling up our country. And by the way, she said levelling up about 20 times in the whole half hour she was speaking. I hate it. I hate that she's saying that. She's ruining video games. Stop it.
Stop it, Liz.
Stop trying to sound like you are in with the kids. But yes, to summarise her speech, it was very, very, very conservative. Yeah. But it's hard to ignore the fact that she kept mentioning how identity politics are bad. Was this a roundabout way to make it clear that she is not on the side of trans people specifically? As gender identity, trans identity, identity politics, it's hard not to differentiate between those? Or am I, jumping the gun here? Am I just being really silly? Because, what the hell does identity politics even mean in her context? What do you think, Ash? Did you have any ideas?
I mean, I think that there is a concept of identity politics, and then there's the way that is kind of thought of and bandied about by conservative politicians and Daily Mail journalists and so on. Because the thing is, identity politics is bad, but then we'll also say, we need to claim back our sovereignty as Britain. And it's okay, so is that whole Britain independence exceptionalism thing, is that not you identifying with something? Is that not kind of an identity politics? So in that sense, once you start thinking about it in those terms, it becomes absolutely seeps into everything, doesn't it? Because those definitions, which we usually self-identify, those definitions of things in society that people will use, the religious or married or whatever, a lot of that, may be influenced by how the person chooses to identify. I'm sure there are some, Prosecco Stormfront Mumsnet warrior types who a huge part of their identity is the fact that they're a mother and a warrior for free speech. And it's that's kind of identity politics, dude. You say, you're railing against this thing that you are also participating in and being a beneficiary of. So to say that she's against identity politics is, in this sense, from a conservative politician, slightly concerning, because I think that means, I'm against identity politics in the sense that it means that I have to care about other people and be interested in their struggles and their lives and pay attention to the things that they say. I don't like that identity politics. I just like the identity politics that keeps us British and nationalistic and really xenophobic. So seemingly it depends what type of identity politics it has, and reminds me slightly of the whole religious freedom thing in America, because it sounds good, right? Religious freedom, everybody's free to practice their own religion. It's actually, no, it's only religious freedom if you are a Christian. For everybody else, it's actually oppressive. So when they say religious freedom, what's actually happening is something very, very different than what you might assume the term means. It's terribly Orwellian. And Liz Truss has done this before, obviously, when she said, oh, no, I think we should get rid of the Women Inequalities Committee and have the Ministry of Freedom instead, which would no doubt be in charge of how many people get locked up in prison. So, yeah, it was all a little, Liz Truss in particular was, as you say, very conservative. Like, the free market is good for gender. Like, what the fuck are you on about? Like, have you heard of the glass ceiling at all? Have you been familiar with the concept of the pay gap? These things that are observable? No? Okay, of course not. You're a conservative. You don't really do evidence, do you? So.
Well, see, that's the strange thing about, her speech in particular, is that, it was always going to be from a very conservative standpoint because she is a free market conservative. She is the Secretary of State for Business, International Trade, I believe. I can't remember the exact title, but basically she is a minister whose brief includes business as well as women inequalities. So it made sense that she was going to go down that path, but it was just seemed very, I don't know, in all of the feminist spaces that I've been in and all the feminists that I've talked to, I've never ever met a single one who has said the free market has been good for women.
Yes, quite. Particularly because if the free market was truly free and we were all libertarian and companies can do what they want with no other government oversight, you can be absolutely sure that there would be a bunch of companies run by men out there insisting, as some companies have done, that women must wear high heels and skirts and that women have to do this and that and blah, 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 Yeah. So to say that the free market protects gender rights is bollocks. That's clearly a fallacious argument.
It could be read from her speech that when she's talking about identity politics, she could be talking about race issues. She could have been talking about sexuality issues. I don't know what identity.
Likely?
I honestly don't know. I don't know what she means by identity politics in that context. And I can only say that because she paid lip service in her speech to women of colour and lesbian and bisexual women, but not trans women. That's what I noticed from it. Although I don't know. Again, this is me assuming that her and her speech people put that together with the intent purpose of making out that trans people are shit. Whereas I think at this point she would probably just say it. So maybe I am being a bit too tinfoil hat about this. But whatever the case, I found the speech incredibly interesting to get insight into how she, not necessarily how she thinks, but how she wants herself to come across to the public. So what did you think? What did you take away from the other two people?
It's I'd say regular offenders. I hadn't heard of Doyle, what's-her-face, the one with the double-barrel surname.
No, neither had I, actually. I hadn't heard of
literally hadn't heard of her before. But I heard of her in pretty short order after she made her speech, of course, because it was all over Pink News and Twitter and stuff. Although, having said that, I just immediately went to saying, oh, it was all over Twitter. I didn't see it on Twitter. I am not on Twitter at the moment. I haven't put it on my new phone, so I've checked it twice in the last 3 weeks. It's awesome. I much prefer this. Anyway. Yeah, but it was just so many of the same canards, but with the slightly unhinged through line, that it was just kind of, because you're with her up to a point where she says trans people just want to get on with their lives. Well, yeah, we do. And we don't want to be in the centre of this culture war. And be a political football. Well, yeah, we do. That's exactly right. Bang on. And then, therefore, we have to legislate against them so they no longer exist and cannot corrupt the innocent children. And we're like, whoa, what the fuck just happened, right? It's like watching an airplane coming into land and it's going perfectly, it's doing really well, and then just suddenly it veers off and becomes a cloud of hippopotamus or something. It's just so completely left field and unexpected where there is no logic connecting those things. So yes, I am sure this woman's name is going to cross our desk once again. Obviously, Joanna Cherry, we've spoken about before. And it was interesting that she kind of lent on the kind of death threats angle. It's you don't call me a transphobe. Being called a transphobe is the same as receiving a death threat. I'm not sure that that's actually what happened. The thing that was actually publicised was when she made a big song and dance about someone a trans activist telling her to, get in the sea or something, or posting some Japanese anime girl thing with an anti-TERF catchphrase on it, and she actually held this up in the Houses of Parliament saying, "Look, women are being bullied," and it's like, that's a meme. That's a meme you've got there, honey. I mean, so yes, Cherry and her sort of unhinged idea that free speech means that she has to be given a platform, well, she and her ilk have to be given a platform, and nobody is allowed to criticize her or call her out for her bigotry. Which, again, that does kind of relate to the system feeding itself. These people want to protect themselves by delegitimizing the concerns of the communities that they are trying to offend or oppress. It's like, oh, well, that's not racism, or that's not homophobia, or whatever, as if they're the ones that get to decide that rather than the community itself. So, yeah, it was a load of shit. But the thing is, these two women who spoke for International Women's Day were in the minority. In that sense, there were other people who stood up and made speeches which were not, transphobatastic. And there was a little postscript to this story, which we will be getting onto at the end, as Michelle has already mentioned. The fact that there was only two of them, plus Liz Truss being fairly ambiguous, but there's only two people standing up specifically repeating these anti-trans talking points, even after these months and months and months and months of press campaigning, anti-trans stuff. Even after all of that, there's still only two of them. That's actually quite a good sign. So
yeah, that, and when people hear that something has been said in Parliament, that automatically gives people the impression that it could necessarily become a law. Like, over the last couple of years, there's been times where various TERF groups have held events in the Houses of Parliament, and people have naturally been very concerned about this. But the simple fact is that these events, the way it works is that an MP can hold an event in pretty much any free room going in the House of Commons, House of Parliament building, and invite people in.
Yep.
And they're nothing more than just a random meeting of people that most of the time a lot of MPs don't turn up to because they happen after 7 o'clock and they're on their way home. And this is very similar to that in that there are a lot of speeches that are made by many different people on International Women's Day when it comes to this particular debate, and they don't necessarily reflect any kind of government policy that may be coming. This is very much individual MPs speaking up about issues they feel that are important.
Indeed.
And it's no sign of any impending doom to come. And also, there was another debate in Parliament that was a lot more positive that we will be going into a little bit at the end of the show as a palate cleanser. So
absolutely,
it wasn't all terrible news from Parliament, and even then, the terrible news was just a couple of people being shitty for 5 to 10 minutes each. Do not panic, but be aware that these people are in Parliament, and obviously, this is a sign that conversations about trans issues are taking place in Parliament. So, what is the best thing you can do to combat transphobia in Parliament? Go meet your MP.
We should have practiced that.
Go find your MP. No matter who they are, what party they're with, go to your MP's website or go to the links in the description where we can help you find out who your MP is and arrange to go and meet them in person at a constituency surgery. So next time trans issues comes up in Parliament like this, they will picture your face and be able to put a face to the cause and understand that this is real people and not just some hypothetical trans menace coming to destroy children.
Well, I mean, we sort of are, but that's in, like, the Phase 4 plans, which we're definitely not talking about yet. Anyway,
I've got to remember to cut that out. We can't let the cis people hear that.
Definitely, absolutely.
If this made it in, then I think the sequel will be out. We should make sure to definitely, absolutely cut that last bit.
Definitely. We would be in real trouble if that particular secret were to surface too early. Moving on, though. Yes, so obviously, we're not demanding that you go and meet your MP in person. Some of them are arseholes. But there are of course ways of getting in touch with your MP's team, special advisors. It may be that you can speak to the person themselves and they're receptive and open. It may be that they will just, not agree to meet you in the first place. But the fact is that as a constituent, we are entitled to have those conversations and get in touch with your MP and saying, look, this is something that is of a concern and I want to make sure that you've got the right information. And having actually spoken to a trans person rather than some pamphlets from the LGB Alliance. So, moving on from that lengthful and weighty segment on the goings-on of the British Parliament to a slightly different way of doing the news this week by zipping through our rapid-fire disappointments. To wrap up our terrible news this week, we have a new section, which, terrible stories told so fast that they should be less painful to hear. Is that a thing? I hope that's a thing. Anyway, well, it is now, so are you ready? 3, 2, 1, go. A new theatre adaptation of the Patrick McCabe novel Breakfast on Pluto, which I've actually read, has already done the one thing trans people have asked them not to do by casting a cis man to play the role of the lead character who is a trans woman. Obviously, trans people were not at all happy about this when the announcement of the cis man's hiring sends the message once again that trans women are really actually just men pretending to be women. As a result of this casting choice, trans actor Kate O'Donnell has since quit the production where she was actually due to play the lead character's mother. Telling BBC News, she said, "I was offered the part and realised that with the heaviest of hearts, because West End theatre production roles do not come along every day, especially when you're a trans performer, that I was going to have to decline the role." O'Donnell went on to say that the backlash from the trans community against the casting decision is justified and nothing new, which she is absolutely right. So nice one, Kate. Thanks. In response to the backlash, the producers of the new show put out a statement claiming that trans people have been involved in many areas of the production, saying, we acknowledge that we all need to do more to support the trans community and the development of trans artists, and we are looking to amplify and celebrate trans voices in other ways as part of the production. Bullshit. So someone should perhaps tell them that having a bunch of trans people behind the scenes is all well and good, but when you have a cis man once again playing the biggest trans part, that is still a huge slap in the face. Thanks, guys. Well done. Maybe don't bother making any more casting decisions. Michelle.
And finally, the UK Court of Appeals has ruled that the lack of gender-neutral passports is not a breach of non-binary and non-gendered human rights, after non-gendered campaigner Christy Ellen Kane argued to the court that the government's current policy on gender-neutral passports is unlawful and in violation of Ellen Kane's human rights. The current situation for non-gendered and non-binary and non-binary and others who do not identify as male or female is that they have to lie on their passport applications in order to get a passport. The government has previously stated that they do not see a need for a third gender option in regards to passports, even though I am sure every non-binary person listening to this will be jumping up and down and screaming all the reasons right now. Ellen Kane argued in court that the requirement for her to select either male or female is in direct violation of the right to respect for private life and the right to not be discriminated against on the basis of gender and sex under the European Convention of Human Rights. However, the court disagreed, saying that the government's current policy is not in violation of the European Convention of Human Rights, as recognition of non-binary genders or no gender, as there is not yet any consensus across Council of Europe states in relation to either the broad issue of the recognition of non-binary people or the narrow issue of the use of X, according to a report from the BBC. They did go on to say, however, that there is momentum in Europe in relation to how the status of non-binary people is to be recognised, and that there may come a time when the fair balance has shifted. Talking to the BBC, Ellen Kane went on to say that my legal team, I understand, will be seeking permission from the Supreme Court to go on to the next stage. So hopefully the Supreme Court will come to the right decision when that case hits them and give non-binary people at least one step towards having their gender actually fucking seen and legally accepted. It's probably also worth adding the current government policy when it comes to non-binary people and passports. It can basically be summed up as, no, I don't see why they should.
No specific detriment was the term, isn't it?
That was the exact term they used at the time when they came out with this, like, over a year ago, I think.
It's closer to 3 now, I think. But yeah, there was a big old survey and they said, no specific detriment. And it was a hashtag. And it was quite funny, as in the hashtag was quite funny, but the situation which precipitated it was intensely annoying and, again, one that we have spoken of before and no doubt we will again. So.
Yeah, we'll be following Ellen Kane's continued campaign to make this very, very clear and obvious thing that needs to happen a thing that has happened.
And that is actually all of the news. That's all the news that we've prepared for this week. Obviously, there have been some things that we're not going to be able to cover. There are going to be some things where we have decided not to because we're sick of talking about it. And there are a few things that obviously fit into that category. It does circle around things that we have discussed before and that we have mentioned this very episode. So, all of which is a slightly pretentious way of leading into the next bit of the show, which is, of course, the meat. And this episode's meet we start off with is actually on a fairly current story. You might have seen over the last couple of weeks that the UK newspaper The Guardian has been subject to a fair amount of criticism over their recent glut of anti-trans talking points being featured in the paper. Now, you may also remember some time ago that the staff of The Guardian in the US penned an editorial to their UK colleagues asking, "Hey, so what's with all this transphobia lately?" That American editorial was in response to a series of articles published around that time which took the view that women's rights and trans rights are somehow in opposition to each other. The articles peddled a number of misleading myths and a general just asking questions kind of attitude. And sadly, that American editorial did nothing to stem the tide of this bullshit, and the UK Guardian have been churning out the same tired old hits as all of the other broadsheets. So this current round of criticism of The Guardian was provoked at least in part by an article on the 3rd of March by regular offender Suzanne Moore, which suggested that trans rights are a threat to women in some way. We've heard all of this stuff before. Self-ID will lead to men pretending to be trans to assault women, or about how being trans is inherently misogynistic somehow, or is part of some kind of bourgeoisie immorality. There was nothing new in Moore's article, and in fact she herself has told the same lies, raised the same valid talking points on previous occasions. The transphobia of the British press is something that's noticeable even outside of the UK. Earlier this week, British writer Juliet Jack, author of Trans, a memoir, penned a piece which was published in the New York Times describing some of the problems that we're up against. So I am glad to see this kind of reaction against The Guardian's coverage, though. This kind of current groundswell of support from The Guardian's traditional reader base and some of its own staff members, in fact. It's been publicised recently on this podcast and in other places that at time of recording, a total of 3 staff members who are trans have resigned from the paper due to the culture of toxicity that surrounded the paper's stance on trans issues. I honestly hope that those people go on to find jobs in less awful places, but the problem of The Guardian, ostensibly a left-leaning progressive newspaper, having decided to adopt some of the same views as conservative backbenchers, does not really suggest that they've read the room correctly. Obviously, as well, there's the whole issue of legacy media like papers and magazines and the continued rise and evolution of newer forms of media like YouTube or this podcast that you're listening to right now. Economic forces balancing and governing those two things are different depending on the type of outlet and the kind of material that's being published. There are a lot of reasons in play here. The Guardian, who also publish The Observer, have a physical print edition which is declining in numbers like the sales of so many other printed newspapers. And in a bid to retain or attract new and different readers, editors, and not just at The Guardian, will occasionally air deeply controversial views in a controversy for clicks type deal. Like, I get it, that's how it works. It sucks and I hate it, but I understand that's the system and the logic behind it. But that then got me thinking. There's a lot of people, ourselves included, that have expressed an opinion that the current anti-trans campaigning in the press, indeed by the press, is very reminiscent of the anti-gay news articles of the 1980s and 90s. It is repackaging literally the same arguments that have been slightly polished, sprayed with the glitter of vague left-wing credentials, and then splashed all over the front pages all over again. A moral panic has been created before your very eyes, folks. A lot of the press homophobia in previous decades was of the sort that still occasionally creeps in the papers today, suggesting that gay people are uniquely in some way degenerates or sexual predators, or in some way specifically threatening to children. Does any of that sound familiar?
No.
In the 80s and the 90s particularly, a lot of this negative coverage was of course taking place against the background of the AIDS epidemic. All across Europe and America, millions of people contracted the virus to little or no reactions from national governments or from health services. Ronald Reagan, the president of the USA, famously laughed over the fact that gay men were suffering and dying of the disease. They didn't care. The people in the corridors of power just didn't care because as far as they were concerned, it was infecting the right people. Those pesky gays, those low-income people, undocumented people, or sex workers, and frequently some combination of those things. The powers that be did not care about the AIDS crisis until it became clear that it affected everybody. Viruses, at least, do not discriminate. So against this background of government inaction and in-baked hostility to the LGBT community, conservative-leaning newspapers in the 80s picked up the same beats and churned out content to appeal to it. Anything that was supportive of the LGBT community was seen as a kind of enabling degeneracy. Anybody who wanted to do something positive around LGBT issues was mocked and pilloried in the papers regularly. There were a lot of column inches given over to focusing on the Labour Party as the loony left for supporting LGBT people and the BAME community. Yes, that's right. Despite the ineptitude of the party actually in government, the UK press instead chose to focus on this loony left and accuse Labour of peddling culture war issues that only affect a small minority of people, so why should we bother caring too much about it? Does this sound familiar?
Again, no idea what you're talking about.
The press are not the government, of course, but the government does read the press, so its influence can't really be overlooked. More than that, it can and does shape public opinion. I know one thing a lot of trans people have expressed concern about, or indeed directly encountered, about this current wave of press transphobia is that it can embolden those people who would show us how much they hate us, not by writing an article, but by beating us up in the street. Since that referendum, you know the one, back in 2016, there has been an increase in recorded hate crimes across the board. The trans community are hardly the only ones regularly attacked in the press and on the street, but to be on the receiving end of this can be extremely stressful. Obviously, there's some stuff that we can all do in the face of all of this. Pink News recently actually published a list of 10 things trans people and their allies can do to try and turn the tide and invoke a backlash onto that other backlash, but so check that out if you can, but don't forget to look after yourself, because I don't imagine this is a problem that's particularly going to go away, because everybody's making far too much money by peddling the same retrograde ideas in slightly different packaging. But yes, now, however, Michelle, darling, conversation time. So I know we've kind of thought about it before, haven't we? And we've kind of mentioned that, oh God, it's just like the 80s or whatever. I've never felt, until recently I haven't felt comfortable making that comparison until I heard some other gay guys make it as well. You know, some people who were actually who lived through it and they said, oh God, they're doing exactly the same thing. And I was like, oh God, I'm relieved somehow, even though the situation is terrible. But, so yeah, thoughts? Darling?
Well, in regards to the recent stuff that's been going on with the Guardian kerfuffle, I think there is a distinction to be made between the transphobia of the Guardian and the transphobia of, say, the Times or the Telegraph or any of the other papers that we have covered on this show. In that, and this may seem like a sweeping generalisation of the staff at the Guardian, but I'm going to make it because it is based almost entirely on my experience of people that I have met who have worked for the Guardian. They don't see things the way other people do. I think there needs to be a distinction made between the transphobia of the Guardian and the transphobia of other places. Whereas the Guardian, I think, to a certain extent, are definitely trolling for clicks. I think that is definitely a factor. I also think that there are a lot of people who work at The Guardian who ideologically are very driven towards the side of the gender-critical turf end of things. And I think we've got to say that the people writing this stuff are genuine, true believers in this transphobic ideology that has sprung up. So I believe Guardian transphobia in a way that I don't believe in the same way when it comes to the Times, because I think with the Times, there will be some people there that are basically whipping up and getting into this because, in their words, they find it fascinating, or they can see that it is a controversial subject and are jumping on board, whereas I don't believe that case can be made for people at The Guardian. Having said that, doesn't really matter where the reason behind the transphobia. It's still transphobia and very, very harmful. And this particular Suzanne Moore piece is very much that. It
is, yeah. That's what I was going to say, really. I think, and that's actually why when I was jotting that out, I mentioned the phrase bourgeoisie immorality, because you do see those people that you spoke to outside of Streatham Tube Station and, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, who genuinely believe that being trans is like a bourgeoisie immorality. There are a few people who are this kind of this particular kind of breed of turf, some of whom are themselves trans. It's like super disappointing that it even exists at all, because yes, apparently being gay, that's fine, but being trans, no, you've been affected by bourgeoisie morality. How dare you think that you can be anything other than the worker that you were assigned to be at birth? You know, so I can see where that's come from in kind of left-leaning spaces like The Guardian, but functionally, it is serving the same purpose. It is delegitimizing the concerns of the trans community. It is making trans people feel that their voices are not heard and certainly not respected. So whether there's, I hear what you're saying about Suzanne Moore and Julie Bindel and the others who write for The Guardian being true believers, but realistically the outcome is the same, functionally. It's doing the same thing as it would be as if they were saying, oh, well, I think trans people are evil because I'm a member of the BNP and everything foreign scares me. And I don't like people who can think.
Yeah, I think a good example is Andrew Gilligan, who's someone we've talked about a lot before on this program. I do not believe that Andrew Gilligan truly, genuinely gives a fuck about anything. Based on his career,
yeah, pretty much. Apart from bicycles.
Apart from bicycles, it's basically bicycles, and that's about it with Andrew Gilligan. That's the only thing he has any passion for, based on his reporting. And I have at this point pretty much read everything he's ever done, apart from whatever books he's brought out. Because fuck, I'm not paying money for that shit. If it isn't online, I'm not going to read it. In Andrew Gilligan's case, but yeah, he very much is someone who is whipping this up because. And you can tell by the way he put together his news stories on this, because he would find the way to word things in the way that would bring out the most controversy and the most sensationalism, even though he was working for the Times, which their style guide doesn't really recommend sensationalizing things in the same way the Sun style guide will. If you see what I mean. It's a very different kind of sensationalizing that the Times do.
I was going to say, I'm sure the Times are just as guilty of it with some issues. They just do it using fancier words and everybody gives them a pass for it. Anyway, do carry on.
Whereas with people like Suzanne Moore, she is definitely writing from a place where she is a true believer, and she seems to have come to these beliefs based on another article she has released since, sort of justifying her views based almost entirely on the struggles she has had due to her being a cisgender woman and having to deal with the stuff that cisgender women have to deal with.
Which is no picnic in and of itself, I accept.
Yes, it is no picnic in and of itself, but there's plenty of women who go through those same things who...
Actually, the root cause of all of these problems is trans people who are a threat who must be destroyed.
Well, I think that's a little bit unkind to Suzanne Moore, and if it sounds like I'm defending Suzanne Moore, I am not, bear with me. But based on her writing, she believes that a woman can only say that she is a woman through suffering of some kind of suffering in regards to like her genitals, essentially, and all of the stuff that can do, and how society sees her as someone owning these particular biological parts. But she doesn't seem to say that trans people are in and of itself the reasons for male oppression. What she does do is she doesn't seem to differentiate between trans women and the patriarchy. She seems to be under the assumption that trans women are no different whatsoever from cis men on any level. There is absolutely no difference.
Yeah.
Which is a mistake a lot of people on that side tend to make.
Or choose to make.
Yeah, I was about to say willingly or through ignorance. I'm not too sure which one most of the time. But when it comes to the wider issue of media representation of trans people and stuff, it doesn't really matter why she wrote the things she wrote, whether it comes from a place of deep belief or whether she just wants to stir the pot and justify herself as a columnist at The Guardian continuing as a columnist in the future because she can write some provocative shit. But yeah, I don't think there's... I think that when it comes to the wider issue of the coverage of trans issues and comparing it to the coverage of homosexuals and homophobic coverage in the 80s and 70s in regards to HIV and AIDS, that is one difference. Whereas back then, from the articles that were coming out then, that doesn't seem to be coming particularly from a very strong ideological belief. That seems to come from get as many eyes on us as possible. Let's whip up some shit and see what happens. There's a lot of people panicking about HIV. Let's go to town and use this to write a story. So that is one key difference when it comes to the Suzanne case.
Indeed. And that's the thing. I think there's another valid comparison here, which somebody else drew, which is basically it's about an information vacuum. And when there's no sort of official word from the government, there's no plan been released for how they're going to be dealing with this potential public health crisis. Does any of this sound familiar? Anyway, but the vacuum created by that lack of action from the American and the British governments initially in the 80s when the first cases of HIV and AIDS first started to appear, and they didn't do anything and they didn't say anything about it, and so the press was then able to very much spin its own narrative and talk a lot about, predatory gay men wanting to infect your children, etc. And I would argue that something similar has happened here, given that we've had that GRA consultation, which, deliberately or otherwise whipped up a lot of people into a kind of frenzy that trans people are about to destroy the universe. And given the fact that the government has sat on that consultation information for however long it's been, over a year now, that vacuum of information where the government hasn't said one thing or the other is just contributing to that press hostility, because they can get away with saying stuff that the government, they can say it because it's not true yet, kind of thing. And then, so plans could be ministers may request that blah, 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 because if they hedge their bets when they're writing a newspaper article, it still works. And then when the facts are out and the government actually does take a line on something, then you know what you're up against, kind of thing. But I would argue that kind of lack of information from the government, it has once again exacerbated the derision and hatred that we've encountered from the press.
Yeah, that's a damn good point, because right now, as it stands, nobody in the UK outside of the Government Equalities Office or the government knows what their version of GRA reform would be or what self-ID would mean in the future. They haven't said what it is. So then you get people
filling in the blanks for themselves.
Yeah, you get people like Jackie Doyle-Price in Parliament saying that giving GRA reform and self-ID to the trans population will result in X, Y, and Z, when they don't even know what GRA reform would be. They don't know. They're just saying that, if we get GRA reform and self-ID, that means that predators will be able to have access to women's toilets. I mean, there's two problems for that. For a start, predators already do. Yep. There's no birth certificate check on the door. GRA reform's obviously about reforming the way people can amend their birth certificate.
That's literally it. It doesn't do anything else.
Yeah, so that's one big flaw. But the other major thing that they all seem to be doing is they seem to make the argument that, this will mean that rapists will be allowed into, women's refuges and stuff. And you don't know that because you don't know what exemptions or what other parts of GRA reform will be included in that. You don't know. Maybe the government will come up with some kind of version of self-ID with the exception of prisons and God knows where else, for all you know. People are saying with definite certainty that GRA reform will do this. And then that is being repeated in the press. It was repeated in Suzanne Moore's article. And that has just become fact. And that goes into another aspect when comparing to the 70s and 80s, is at the time, they didn't know what HIV or AIDS were. That was still evolving, the understanding of what this virus was, and even how it applies to the gay community. But they decided that was the situation, so they reported it anyway.
Yeah, pretty much. So then that ended up with, a lot of the press coverage focusing on, why should we pay for healthcare for people who refuse to wear a condom? Or why should we pay for healthcare for people who insist that they're trans? The NHS has to pay for this and that and the other. The NHS has to do cancer treatment. Why on earth should it spend money on you? You weird, deluded people. We're always going to be the last to be considered, right? You'll get what you asked for when we've sorted everything else out. And obviously, newsflash, not going to ever be at a point where everything else has been sorted out to please these people to the extent where they say, okay, yeah, trans healthcare is acceptable now. So we thought we'd have a look at, do a little bit of a comparison, see where some of the differences are, see where some of the similarities are. And honestly, there's so much of the underpinning, ideology behind it, which has seen so many people who are really, really devoted to their cause, like cult-like. There's an almost religious level of fervor among some of the gender critical types who are so convinced of their ideology that it's their entire life. And yet they're the ones that say, oh, trans is a cult. And trans ideology is this, that, and the other. It's like, no, that's you guys. Again, as several people keep saying, we honestly just want to get through the shift and maybe go home and have friends and do nice things.
I didn't really meet that many trans people in the 2 years after I came out. You know what I mean? If it was a cult, it's a pretty shitty cult because I managed to become a member completely on my own with nothing but Google.
And, well done on you for finding us. Anyway, so I think that about wraps it up for God. No, that wraps it up for this particular segment of the episode, and therefore, for more or less, it is the end of the episode itself. So you can, of course, find us on the social medias, Facebook /WhatTheTrans, Twitter @WhatTheTrans. We also have a we also have a shiny, very cool, very nice, slick-looking new website, which is whatthetrans.com. So you can check us out there. That's also got our link to our Patreon, and that's also hosting all of the episodes, so you can go back and listen to us from back in the days before we had decent microphones. Again, sorry about that.
And speaking of Patreon, I would like to very much thank our patrons for donating their money to us. Right now, all of the money that we get goes towards covering the cost of hosting on Libsyn, which is like $15 a month. It covers our web hosting costs, which come to roughly like a tenner a month, I believe. I can't remember exactly. And also there's going to be a bunch of money that we're paying back to our awesome IT tech queen person, Lexi, who paid for the website out of her own pocket. So we're going to be sending a bunch of money to pay her back. And all the other money, I have no idea what we're going to do with it, but we'll let you know when we decide to do something with it. So, to thank our patrons, thank you very much, Alexandra Lilly, Anthony Pena, April Heller, Becky Scott Fairley, Bernard Pink Jellybean, Cassius Adair, Chocolate Eclair, Chris Hubley, Elliot McVeigh, Ian Cumber, Karakan12, Catherine, Lacquer, Lauren O'Neans, Lenos, Maddie Bell, Matt Reynolds, Melissa Brooks, Mina, Molly, and Sophie Lewis. Thank you so much for your patronage. We love it. We appreciate you. Thank you very much. And so, to draw this show to a close, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned that there were 2 debates in Parliament worth talking about, and we focus on mostly the trans-negative International Women's Day debate at the top of the show, mostly to get the bad out of the way. But we don't want to ignore the good, and we are going to use the good to end the show on a much more positive note than it would have done without. So, on the 10th of March, a general parliamentary debate on LGBT plus health inequality and LGBT Women's Health Week took place, and while some very serious topics were discussed, there was also a lot of evidence that we have some solid allies in Parliament right now. Whilst 5 days earlier, International Women's Day in Parliament was marked by transphobia and dogshit, Hannah Bardell, MP for the Scottish National Party, and a cis gay woman, spoke for 30 minutes about the issues facing LGBT people when it comes to seeking healthcare, but she chose to mostly talk about the current issues facing trans people, from the media being bellends to us all the time, to the rising number of hate crimes being committed against members of our community, and how transphobia has become an acceptable bigotry. This sentiment was then echoed by many others who spoke during the debate, including Conservative MPs Crispin Blunt and Dr. Ben Spencer, who made it clear that there are trans-inclusive Conservatives on the backbench. There's not many of them, but there's a few. And not only do we have the MPs who spoke out for us during this debate, and there is a link on the sheet where you can watch the whole thing, it is important to note that as it stands right now, we have allies in Parliament including Dawn Butler, Mary Black, Caroline Lucas, as well as all 3 of the current Labour Party leadership candidates to varying degrees, Keir Starmer, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Lisa Nandy, as well as former Women and Equality Select Committee Chair Maria Miller, and many, many others. So while it can look hopeless when MPs are openly parroting Mumsnet talking points in Parliament unchallenged, there are also countless others who have our backs, and we are not doomed by any means. So to end the show, we are going to play you out with some clips from Hannah Bardell's amazing speech. So, see you next time, and take it away, Hannah Bardell. Goodbye, everyone.
I also want to thank the many folk who contacted me after I put a shout out on social media asking for lesbian, bisexual and transgender women's experiences of health inequality. Now, I'm sure that everybody in this House will agree on the ills of social media, but I also hope that we can agree that there are times when it can be incredibly positive and constructive, a tool for us to engage. At a time when this Parliament and the politics of this place can seem very far from folks' lives, I've appreciated the ability to reach out to the public via Twitter and other social media channels, and I will shortly share some of the experiences that members of the public have shared with me on this issue. Some of them I know were very painful and very difficult to relive and recount. And the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are many facets to the discussion and debate on healthcare of LGBTQ people and women in the LGBTQ community. And I think the fact there's a specific week to raise awareness when there is so many other issues going on is really helpful. Because the Science and Technology Committee report states there is emerging evidence demonstrating that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and other minority sexuality, gender identity groups experience significant health inequalities across their lifespan, often starting at a young age. And as I said, as someone who came out literally as I was being elected to myself, I came out initially and then later to my family and friends and publicly sometime after that. That was challenging. And it's fair to say that the impact on my mental health was profound. There was not exactly, as most of us who have been here since 2015 will know, time to process any personal challenges or issues. But my experience of certainly coming out publicly was a hugely positive one, and social media played a part in that. Taking part in a photograph of LGBTQ MPs and peers, which then went online and attracted much attention, showed the solidarity, not just in this place and at the time in the other place for LGBT politicians, but across wider society. It was a hugely positive thing. But I'm also very, very conscious that I had an incredibly supportive network of family and friends, and also that I have a very privileged position. And in many ways, I came out with the cover of political privilege. That is something that very, very few other people across the UK and beyond have. And we must always remember the challenges that folk across the UK and beyond face in coming out, and the many countries where it is still illegal and people are persecuted for being LGBTQ.
Would the honourable member take?
I'd be happy to give way.
On that very point, does the honourable member feel that at this time we should include in our thoughts those lesbian, bi and trans women who are asylum seekers and have been asked by this government to prove that?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I absolutely agree with what she is saying, and there are a number of stories in the press at the moment about LGBT asylum seekers that are hugely concerning. And I would like to think that, given the distance that we have travelled, that this government will review the processes and the policies that it has and look very, very carefully about the treatment of LGBT asylum seekers. I have met a number of them myself, and there is some incredibly important work ongoing. But stories that we are reading in the press and the experiences that we are hearing of LGBT asylum seekers is deeply troubling. And I absolutely agree with what she is saying. Now, for anybody coming out a bit later in life, I discovered recently that middle age is being classed between 30 and 50. I have to say that was a shocking discovery. You know, there are...
That's middle youth.
That's middle youth, as my honourable friend says, and I would absolutely agree with that. There is, for many people, and there was for me, an element of regret and in fact mourning for a life not lived as your authentic self. And it's hard to describe what that feels like. I try very hard to look forward, to make the most of what's in front of me, not to look back and have regrets that I wasn't living my life as my true self. And there are many reasons why people come out later in life. And there is also much research around the profound impact that has on people's mental and physical health. It can be, coming out as lesbian, gay or bisexual can be a very different experience from coming out as trans. I can't imagine how incredibly difficult that is. particularly in the current climate. But we owe it to our trans and non-binary citizens to support them and ensure that debate and discussion around changes in legislation or any matters relating to their lives and their health care is conducted in a respectful and decent way. And sadly, I think we can all agree that there are times recently that has not happened and is not happening at present.
Would my honourable friend agree that while it now seems to be socially unacceptable to express anti-gay thoughts and feelings, by contrast, we appear to now be having an open season on trans people, and it's deplorable, and does she agree with me that it must be deeply disturbing for young trans people who are trying to come to terms with who they are?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I would absolutely agree with them. And whilst discussions about technical details of legislation and concerns that people may have, can and should be discussed, they have to be discussed in a respectful way. And the open season, as he says, on trans people, and some of the rhetoric that you could literally cut and paste from the 80s and the 70s that was used against lesbian and gay and bi people, now being used against trans people, is just utterly deplorable, as he says, and we must do everything we can to protect trans and non-binary people's rights and indeed their mental health. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we know the LGBT community, including lesbian, bi and trans women, experience significant health inequalities and specific barriers to services and support. Stonewall Scotland's survey of LGBT people in Scotland found that half of LGBT people have experienced depression in the last year, including 7 in 10 trans people. More than half of trans people have thought of taking their own life in the last year, and let's just reflect on that. Half of trans people have thought of taking their own life in the last year. So when we think about the debate that is currently ongoing, and when we reflect on that, we must look at that statistic and take it very, very seriously. Happy to give way.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. When you say half of trans people, can you put a figure on that? Because I would like to know that, because it's terribly sad.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The statistics that are within that Stonewall Scotland report are specific to Scotland, so that's 52%. I don't have the exact numbers, but I would be very happy to get those and to share those with the right honourable gentleman. But it's a significant number. And 1 in 6 LGBT people have deliberately harmed themselves in the last year. 1 in 4 LGBT people have witnessed discriminatory or negative remarks against LGBT people by healthcare staff. 1 in 8 LGBT people have received unequal treatment in the healthcare system because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And almost 2 in 5 trans people have avoided healthcare treatments for fear of discrimination. 1 in 4 LGBT people have experienced healthcare staff having a lack of understanding of specific lesbian, gay and bi health needs. And nearly 3 in 5 trans people have experienced healthcare staff having a lack of understanding of specific trans health needs. Now, I understand that some of these matters are very technical and they are challenging, and it requires a level of expertise. That is why education, an open discussion and proper resourcing in Scotland and across the UK is absolutely vital.